I'm delighted today to be speaking to James Whitaker, who's a partner at PwC down here in Cape Town. Welcome, James.
Thank you, David. Good to be here.
So I look forward to discussing the latest trends in wealth structuring from South Africa, particularly focusing in on offshore trust, which is your specialist area. But before we get into that, it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about your background and how you came to be working here in South Africa.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. So after doing some travelling post-university, I joined Coopers & Lybrand in London in 1993. And at that stage, I was providing advice to US bankers working in London, so a very particular client base. And after 7 years of that, I decided that it was time for a change and moved to Cape Town.
Wonderful. And we're here at the Mount Nelson Hotel, which is a splendid place. I mean, I imagine the lifestyle down here and your working environment is hugely interesting, and over your career it must have been a very rewarding place to work.
It has. So in 2000, when I moved out here, we had a new tax regime which came in terms of the residence basis of tax and then capital gains tax a few months later. And I set up an expatriate tax practice, so for companies moving individuals cross-border. And then as individuals came off those programs, they said, could we continue to do their tax work privately? And we soon realized that that was quite a market in itself, and indeed a lot of high net worth individuals living in Cape Town. And what better place, as you say, to be based dealing with a great market.
Wonderful. So just looking at the kind of wealth structuring toolkit, if you like, in South Africa, there's lots of different options. The trust is pretty front and centre, but also you have insurance wrappers, pensions. There's lots of things people might use. I mean, how do you see it in terms of clients and the different structures they might use to preserve and enhance wealth?
Yeah, so David, the main three that we see really are around corporate structures and obviously for family businesses moving cross-border, that those often are utilised. Some foreign pensions, but most predominantly foreign trusts. I guess just because of the flexibility associated with foreign trusts, those seem to be definitely the most popular of all of them.
And there's a strong heritage and legacy of people using trusts to structure wealth, aren't there? Familiarity. So I imagine that throws up a lot of issues because there's structures going back a long time as well as new structures being set up. So how do you see what do people get wrong sometimes with the structures that are being operated?
So you're absolutely right. Traditionally, South Africans, if they didn't have a trust, then there's something wrong with you. What's going on? That was sort of 20, 30 years ago. And it was all about the tax savings. So I'm going to do this for the benefit of saving tax. The world has moved on, as we know, very significantly. And if a client comes to me and says, I want to set up a trust because I want to save tax, then I'll suggest that maybe I'm the wrong person to speak to, or the trust isn't a tax-saving vehicle. Really, the driving force behind trusts, particularly offshore trusts, I think the advantages is obviously the diversification of an asset base, succession planning, protecting the next generation, protecting the wealth, some creditor protection as well, and indeed, of course, the not having the need of having probate, which is I think is pretty significant when there's a passing of a family member. We can still distribute assets, whereas we know all the difficulties with estates and probate. So those are probably the big advantages that we speak about.
And for that planning to be effective, there has to be a ceding of control and striking that balance with powerful settlors or business owners who've built the wealth. I mean, how do you kind of address that thorny issue of how much control those settling the assets can have on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so once we've had the tax discussion, the ceding of control is really very much alongside that. So some clients will come along and say, I want to have an offshore trust, and this is how I'm going to control it. And the discussion goes around the lines of, well, these are not your assets anymore. So you need to get your head around that. If you can't get your head around that, then this isn't the right structure for you. Because definitely, the first question is are those still your assets? And if there's too much, or if there's really any significant control, then those would be assets for both estate duty, and indeed it could potentially bring in the offshore trust within the South African tax regime because the trust would be resident here in South Africa if it was managed and controlled here, and therefore the income and gains would be taxable within the South African regime.
Because there's a strong difference between having a local South African trust and an offshore trust. I mean, perhaps you could break down how you generally see the local and international piece working.
Yeah, so typically the two trusts are used for very different purposes. So South African trust is a relatively cheap structure to set up. Until relatively recently, individuals could loan funds or assets to a South African trust. Those assets would grow in value, and the growth would be outside of the estate duty regime. Whereas in the last few years, a new section of legislation has come in to actually effectively retain the growth of those assets within the estate because an interest charge is imputed, which brings back an annual donations charge on the settlor or lenders of the trust. But those trusts are typically used to house South African assets. They're within the South African exchange control regime, within the South African tax regime, and then the offshore trusts really are utilised to house offshore assets, and typically there's not a leg back into South Africa just because of the complexities.
And loop structures are quite an interesting development locally that allows offshore companies to reinvest back into South Africa. Perhaps you could just explain a little bit about that and how you're seeing them being used.
Yes, I think the jury is still out on that because I think the Exchange Control Authority said that we're really doing away with the loop structures in terms of the rules and regulations, or that's what the industry thought. And then actually, as soon as there's reinvestment back, there's still questions around whether those are allowable and the complexities associated with it. And hence the advice is generally to keep the South African trust for local assets and the foreign trust for foreign assets. But that's just really a developing area, because I think that we need to be encouraging foreign entities to be reinvesting back into South Africa. So still I think the historical loops that were there don't necessarily immediately get legitimised just because of these rule changes.
And for families interested in impact investment or more socially purpose-driven investments, do you see those being done under trust structures or externally, or do you notice any themes around that?
Not particularly. I certainly philanthropy is very much the theme these days in terms of what leg of the family office is going to be investing, doing good. In fact, at the session at Jersey Finance a couple of days ago, there's a whole session around ESG and what that means to different families, but I haven't yet seen it in a particular structure.
Okay, and I suppose if they have a particular charitable purpose they want to fulfil, they might just do that under a separate charitable trust rather than under the umbrella.
Agreed. Makes sense.
And just more broadly on the family office space, I mean, do you deal with family offices based here or in London or elsewhere, or what trends do you see of the family office for the South African families that you deal with?
Yeah, so the family offices typically seem to be in South Africa. And they're still relatively small in size compared to the big US and UK family offices. So it seems to be where the main part of the family is based. And they fulfill different functions, as you know. Some of them are just coordination, some of them have a full office with investment advisors. So it's really quite bespoke per family.
And if you have a family with operating businesses here, are they generally owned and managed through the local trust that you mentioned, or do foreign international trustees, are they involved in owning some of those local assets, or how does that tend to work?
Typically it seems to be the local structures and the local trusts that house the local assets. So it's interesting, over time, we've seen actually all of these South African businesses, family businesses, very often actually just remaining completely domestic in South Africa. And only really when there's some kind of event, a sale of business, sale of part of the business, then there's a liquidation, and then we think about, okay, well, what's the best use of these funds? Because typically they're tied up until then within the business.
And I guess one of the big threats to family wealth is often divorce, actually. So do you see that these trust structures are protected through people using pre-nups and things like that? What kind of trends do you see around protection?
I think that, again, there's a lot of interesting views around that. When in South Africa, trusts have almost become an extension of the family. So the main property, the principal residence is held within the trust. And so really that's part of the family's assets. So it's quite difficult in the case of a divorce. I think that's likely to fall within the general remit of what assets are divided up. Although I'm not a legal advisor.
No.
Whereas if you look at the old family wealth that's structured within a bona fide offshore trust, then that's obviously typically outside of the estate for both for tax estate duty purposes and in terms of divorce.
And for beneficiaries, I mean, what rights to information do they have about the trust? Is it possible to hatch a plan with the settlor or to set up a structure with discretionary beneficiaries, and not to be able to provide information to those who might ultimately benefit from it, who might want information about it? What are the rights there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases we see that beneficiaries are they don't even know that they're beneficiaries. So you've got that at one end, and then at the other end, of course, you've got beneficiaries who are very much involved in understanding of what's happening in the trust. And I think it depends on the particular family, the age of the beneficiaries, what the purpose of the trust is. So I don't think there's really one answer to that question.
And can beneficiaries start becoming a bit litigious if they believe the trust assets aren't being run in a certain way? Or there's a tension there, isn't there, between the family perhaps about how things should be done and trustees being used, or how the trust assets are being managed?
Certainly, David, when I speak to trustees, they are very, very conscious of that point. And any decisions that they are taking, they are thinking very carefully about the beneficiaries and am I protecting, as a trustee, the beneficiary's position, or something that I'm doing for one beneficiary, how does this impact another beneficiary? So particularly the offshore trustees who are based in regulated places, Channel Islands, Isle of Man, I think they're very conscious of their responsibilities around that.
And what about the sort of new types of assets that are coming through, like the crypto and digital assets? I mean, trustees that I speak to, it's quite a hot topic to work out how they can be incorporated into structures, because clients are looking at their total, estate and working out how to build that in. Is that something that you're seeing with some of the professionals or some of the families?
We have seen that question being asked, but because South Africa, I think, was quite early as an adopter within the crypto digital space, what we saw is typically South African platforms providing access to digital and crypto, and then individuals investing in that and building up wealth within the South African platform, and then wanting to take that offshore once that's grown in value significantly, which is pretty difficult because of the South African exchange control regime. And then if you've got to realise those assets in terms of taking them offshore, there's probably a massive tax hit that's going to go with that. So people are still really getting their arms around that. And of course, the volatility in terms of the value of those assets just adds a further layer of complexity, plus the relative uncertainty around the tax treatment.
And then trustees have got to consider things like safe custody, or for NFTs, insurance. There's lots of question marks, isn't there, still hanging around the industry, I think, on things like
very
this.
much so. And I think trustees have an element of nervousness about it, and indeed looking back at the source of funds when there's any crypto and digital.
And just more broadly on an area of tax dispute, I mean, do you deal with clients who have inquiries from South African Revenue Service? What are some of the trends there from how they get picked up or on their radar?
So typically, David, there's really three areas where we see investigations and disputes. One is around when an individual is seeking to take funds offshore and they are applying for a foreign investment allowance certificate through the South African Revenue Service, and that's an opportunity to ask questions around sources of funds, look at companies and trusts, which might be sort of an extension of that individual structure.
So might that be if they wanted to seed a company, say they wanted to set up a UK operation, they'd get permission to get those funds out in a legitimate fashion?
Indeed, yes,
Right,
exactly,
okay.
exactly. So, or if there's a big vesting of a share option gain, and then typically those individuals, they might not be emigrating per se, but they might be financially emigrating in terms of taking a chunk of their wealth out. So we really advise clients in that scenario to make sure everything is in very good order before applying for the foreign investment allowance certificate. And then of course there's a lot of talk in the press and what the South African Revenue Service have said in terms of looking at lifestyle audits. So really matching up the individual's lifestyle with what income they might have declared on their tax return, and if there's a mismatch between that, asking some tricky questions of that individual. And then thirdly, whilst the automatic exchange of information, CRS, I don't think in itself has created a whole host of questions and queries, we have seen through the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers a number of queries going out to clients in terms of explaining the structures that they're involved in.
And on that increase in information flowing about, does that just encourage clients to think, well, that the ostrich approach, putting their head in the sand, is just not credible because there is all of this information through other variety of financial institutions or otherwise, so that information will come to light?
So definitely, I mean, my advice to clients is, anything which is out there, you need to assume that all the tax authorities have full access to. So, whether it's a UK bank account, a US bank account, and the South African Revenue Service could, in theory, have access to that. So it's important really to work with an advisor who is comfortable in terms of not just assistance with the planning, but the implementation around disclosure. And then indeed, if something is discovered which hasn't been disclosed as it should have been, then of course there is this voluntary disclosure regime which is ongoing, which is a great opportunity to make disclosure. And really the only cost which goes with that, in addition to the tax, is the interest, which is really quite a fair regime. So it's about approaching the revenue authorities before you get approached.
Is there challenges around residency, around mobile families and people spending time? I mean, is residency a key part of the tax liability that you might have in South Africa, and breaking tax residency, is that equally as important as somewhere like the UK?
It is absolutely key. It's just as important as the UK. And in fact, there's two definitions of residency in South Africa, and the difficult one is the ordinary residence concept. So it's where you are habitually based. And in the old days, the family moved to South Africa and they were here for sort of 5 years, or they were here for good, and it was relatively easy. Now you've got some of the family living here, some elsewhere in Europe, and
globe-trotting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that is actually can be very tricky in terms of making that residency determination. The tax treaties help, and indeed the South African Revenue Service also will provide clarity in the case of someone leaving South Africa to confirm that the person has exited from a residency perspective. So that certainly helps. But it's an area of real debate, and there's the court cases are quite old, and the legislation probably hasn't really kept up with the sort of modern lifestyle of individuals.
Particularly in the area of mobile working and work from home and things like that.
Yeah, so that's why I guess we saw in the UK the whole statutory residence test which came in, which brought certainty, and even though it's pretty complicated, you can work through it and eventually get to a point to make that determination.
So we're coming to the end of 2022. I mean, what in the calendar is going to be happening in 2023? What are some of the things that you see coming down the line? What are things people should be aware of, thinking about? Is there anything particular in the next calendar year that is going to be a hot topic?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because in February 22, the budget statement in South Africa made mention of making disclosure of assets where anyone has assets of more than 30 million rand, and putting those assets on the tax return at market value. And those individuals might not necessarily have a requirement to provide details of those assets at the moment. So high net worth individuals are certainly wondering about that. And what does that mean? Do I want to provide all that information and the implications of it? And then, of course, there has been talk from time to time around wealth taxes, and with the challenge that all governments are facing in terms of the revenue take versus the costs of running the country. Is that something that we will see happening? The official view in South Africa seems to be that we haven't made a decision whether it's on the table or off the table, but it's certainly not off the table at this stage.
Okay, very interesting. And you're coming to the networking dinner here tomorrow night at the Mount Nelson. I mean, imagine working with other intermediaries in banks or trustees are a common part of your day-to-day. I mean, where do you tend to work? What type of intermediaries do you tend to work with, and where?
Yeah, so at PwC, because we don't provide investment advice, intermediaries quite like working with us because we've got the specialist cross-border tax advice. We also do the implementation of that advice in terms of tax compliance, so we're not competing. So it's really a complementary service. So the banks, the family offices, a whole range of intermediaries really we enjoy working with on an informal basis.
Wonderful. Well, look, James, thanks for talking to me today, and I look forward to sharing this interview.
Thanks very much, David. I've enjoyed it.
The latest technical content delivered through global conversations with professionals for professionals.